You know, there are stories that haunt us, stories that when we hear them stick in our minds and refuse to leave. Today, I'm going to share 3 accounts sent by people just like you. Real stories, or at least that's what they say. Accounts of ordinary encounters that took an unexpected and terrifying turn. Each story involves the unknown, the unexpected, and that unsettling touch that reality sometimes knows how to add. Maybe you've experienced something similar, or know someone who has. Something that started as a simple move to a new house, a nighttime trip, or even a mentorship relationship. Ordinary things that suddenly spiraled into a chilling mystery. What I'm about to share are stories of people who, even in the most mundane situations, ended up crossing the line between the normal and the incomprehensible. If you're ready to explore these boundaries, if you're willing to face what might lie beyond, then stay with me. It all started when he moved into a new house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by silent streets and trees that cast shadows over the asphalt. It was one of those places where people preferred anonymity. No one intruded on anyone else's privacy. Next door lived an elderly man. He seemed to live alone and spent most of his time inside. Occasionally, he would appear in the backyard, standing still, staring at something, as if contemplating something only he could see. There was an empty aura in that gaze, a feeling hard to define. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't exactly friendliness either. It was as if he was just watching. The first days in that house passed without incident. But occasionally, when he looked out the window, he would see the old man standing there watching, not discreetly but openly, with an expression that mixed curiosity with something else, something almost unsettling. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he heard a sound from outside, a faint, irregular sound, like something scratching the ground. He looked out the window, and there was the old man, standing in the yard. This time his gaze was fixed on the house. No expression, no movement, just the motionless figure in the darkness, surrounded by the twilight of the night. The next morning, the sound seemed like a bad dream. He convinced himself that maybe he was imagining things. After all, it was just an eccentric neighbor. But as the days went by, the old man's gaze became more frequent, more intrusive. Something didn't seem right, but he ignored it, or tried to ignore it. As the weeks passed, the strange encounters became impossible to ignore. During the day, he noticed footprints near the windows, as if someone had walked through the garden right next to the house. At night, the noises continued. Footsteps that sounded close, but were never visible. One early morning, he woke up with a sense of unease that was hard to describe. He got up and went to the living room without turning on the lights. Outside, in the darkness of the yard, a shadow was standing still. It was the old man again, but this time he seemed even closer, almost on the porch. He didn't move, he just stood there, silently, staring at the house. The tension grew. The discomfort became unbearable. On an impulse, he went outside to confront him. But when he opened the door, the yard was empty, no sign of movement. He went back inside with a strange feeling that he was being watched all the time, as if that old man was always one step ahead, always knowing when he would take action. One morning, when he opened the front door, he found something that made his blood run cold. Small objects left on the doorstep, as if someone had carefully placed them there during the night. They were seemingly ordinary things, a coat button, a polished stone, and even a lock of gray hair. But together there, arranged deliberately, they seemed to form a silent and unsettling message. A message meant for him. Overcome with anxiety and the urge to get to the bottom of it all, he decided to confront the old man that very day. He went next door and knocked on the door. When the man opened it, his gaze was the same as always, empty, enigmatic, with no sign of surprise or guilt. He asked him about the objects, about the noises, about the constant appearances in the yard. The old man, with a slight enigmatic smile, simply denied everything. No explanation, no argument, just a smile. A smile that seemed to hold too many secrets, as if the mere denial was part of a game he couldn't understand. The situation was far from having an answer, but the tension only grew. That night, he barely managed to sleep. Every sound, every shadow seemed to whisper something he didn't want to hear. Around 3 in the morning, he woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling of alertness. His heart racing, he got up and peeked out the window. And then he saw it, a figure in the garden, right in front of the house, motionless, staring directly at him. But something was different. That figure didn't just look like the old neighbor. There was something unsettling about its posture, something that made every fiber of his body scream danger. And then he realized that figure wasn't outside. It was inside the house, across the room, standing in the shadows. In a desperate impulse, he backed away and grabbed the phone, calling the police, explaining in nervous whispers what was happening. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. When the officers arrived and searched the house, they found no one. No presence, no sign of a break-in, nothing that confirmed what he had seen, just the eerie silence of an empty house. The next day, he decided to leave, abandoning the house and that neighbor who never seemed to be truly alone. Since then, he never returned, but the mystery and that figure, those stayed forever in his memory. It was a simple and seemingly harmless routine. Every night, he would take the train to work. The empty platforms and the muffled silence of the train at that hour felt like a refuge, a space almost no one shared. Sometimes he felt like the only occupant of that nighttime world, with the dark landscape rushing by silently through the windows. But it was during one of these solitary trips that he saw him for the first time. Sitting at the back of the car, half hidden in the shadows, there was a man. It was strange how he was there, watching him, without looking away. His eyes fixed with a slight smile, a smile that held no joy, but a disturbing stillness made him feel uncomfortable. And the train continued on, in that silence that suddenly seemed oppressive. The next night, when he boarded the train, his eyes instinctively searched the back of the car. There he was, the man with the same smile, the same fixed and unsettling gaze. It seemed like he was waiting for him. The car was almost empty, but the man didn't bother to disguise his stare. It was as if he was studying every move he made, as if he already knew more than he should. The discomfort was palpable, but he tried to ignore it. He changed seats, looked away, checked his watch to see how much longer until his station. But it was impossible not to feel the weight of that stare. It was as if the man wanted him to know he was being watched, and to make everything even stranger, his smile seemed to grow every time their eyes met. That night, when he finally got off the train, he felt a chill, a sense that something very wrong was about to happen. But that was just the beginning. In the following nights, the man kept showing up, as if he were part of the train routine itself. Always in the same place, always with the same fixed stare and enigmatic smile. He tried to avoid him. He'd change cars, switch seats, even delay his entry onto the platform a little, but nothing worked. At some point during the ride, there he was, the man with the piercing gaze, slowly getting closer. Each night, the man seemed to sit closer, as if he were shortening the distance between them, not in a rush, but with disturbing precision. Once, he tried to get off one station earlier and catch another train. But when he boarded the new car, it didn't take long before he saw the man again, sitting at the back with the same smile, like he knew more than he would ever understand. That's when he realized it wasn't just a coincidence. The man was following him on purpose, and the discomfort began to turn into a growing fear, a fear that with each passing night felt more real and unavoidable. One of those nights, when the car was almost empty, the man finally approached. He sat right next to him, the smile now more intense, his eyes fixed, full of something he couldn't interpret, something between amusement and threat. And then, without warning, the man leaned in and whispered something incomprehensible, a low, dragged-out murmur, like a secret meant only for him. The whisper seemed to echo in his mind, even after he moved away and tried to ignore what had just happened. The face of that stranger was becoming more present, not just on the train, but in his own life. He started seeing him in other places, on platforms, on the streets, always at a distance, but always with that same intense stare, as if lurking, waiting for the exact moment. That night, when he saw him again as he got off at the station, an overwhelming feeling took over him. This wasn't a random encounter. The man was there because somehow he knew where he would be, as if he knew his steps better than he did. The next night, as he got off at the station, he felt that chill again. He walked down the empty platform. The silence of the place seemed to amplify the sound of each of his steps. When he looked up, there he was, the man, standing at the end of the platform, his silhouette motionless and dark against the dim lighting. The smile, as always, was a thin, dark line that conveyed more than words ever could. He stopped, his heart racing, but he couldn't move. The figure just stood there, waiting. In a burst of courage or desperation, he turned around and started running, climbing the stairs and leaving the station behind, not caring where he would go, as long as it was as far away as possible. After that night, he never took the night train again. The face of that man, however, still lingered in his thoughts, a haunting reminder that some people, or perhaps something else, cross our paths with an intensity that defies any explanation. He recalls the time when he was in high school, a period where he stood out but also felt a certain pressure to perform well. It was during this time that he received an unexpected offer, the chance to participate in a mentoring program with a highly respected teacher, known for his unusual dedication to students. The proposal seemed like a valuable opportunity, almost a privilege. But something about this mentor's behavior from the start seemed different. This teacher was detailed, attentive, but he also had a peculiar way of asking questions, not just about academic life, but about his emotions, his deepest thoughts. It was as if he were more interested in what was going on inside his students' minds than in their academic results. At the time, it seemed like a form of empathy, but over time, it started to reveal something darker. In the first sessions, the teacher kept a kind, almost paternal tone. He asked deep questions, probing about fears, insecurities, dreams that he wouldn't share with anyone else. Each answer seemed to intrigue him, and he would write everything down in his notebook with an obsession that bordered on discomfort. Over time, the questions became more personal, more probing. The teacher wanted to know about traumas, about difficult experiences, as if he were probing every layer of his mind. With each session, the atmosphere became heavier, and the discomfort grew. The teacher insisted he continue, saying that it was part of a necessary growth, something essential for his evolution. Even though he felt exposed and increasingly suspicious, he felt pressured to continue. After all, this was the teacher everyone admired, someone who supposedly knew what he was doing, but a part of him couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this dynamic. As the weeks went by, the sessions started to take an even darker turn. The teacher seemed determined to explore his negative emotions, encouraging him to relive painful moments and traumas in an almost obsessive way. Every time he hesitated, the teacher would push, saying he needed to release everything to reach his true potential. It was then that the teacher suggested a special exercise. He asked him to close his eyes, to visualize his deepest fears, and to immerse himself in those images until he felt drained. Reluctantly, he began to follow the instructions, but something in the teacher's tone alerted him. The idea of continuing seemed wrong, as if he were being guided to a place from which he wouldn't return the same. At the end of the session, the teacher smiled with a look that seemed more satisfied than concerned, as if he were observing the effects of an experiment. It was at that moment that he realized he wasn't a student under mentorship. He was someone being tested, examined as part of a dark experiment. One night, already overwhelmed by discomfort with the entire situation, he was at home when he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found the teacher there at his door, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He said he needed to discuss an important breakthrough in their work, something that, according to him, couldn't wait. The teacher entered without waiting for an invitation and calmly sat down, opening the same notebook where he had written every detail, every reaction, every fear he had revealed during the sessions. It was then that the teacher began to speak directly, almost without emotion. He confessed that all the sessions were part of a personal experiment. His intention was to explore the emotional limits of students, to understand how far people were willing to go when confronting their own fears. The revelation left him stunned. The trust he had placed in that mentor was shattered in an instant, turning into a feeling of exposure and betrayal. Feeling vulnerable and violated, he ended the mentorship right then and there and asked the teacher to leave. However, the teacher left with one last look, as if what he had discovered was only the beginning of what he wanted. After the mentorship ended, the teacher's presence continued to haunt him, no longer in person, but in his mind. The questions, the painful memories he had explored, and the teacher's unsettling gaze seemed to resurface in his thoughts, especially at night, becoming a kind of mental pursuit. Over time, he discovered that he wasn't the only one. Other students had gone through similar experiences, many of them also left with deep, hard-to-erase scars. The sense of manipulation and emotional abuse now revealed left an invisible but ever-present mark. Something in the teacher's behavior, that meticulous coldness, suggested he was part of a psychological game few would understand. The story ends with him reflecting on the consequences of trusting someone who presents themselves as a guide, but hides their own intentions. Some encounters, he concluded, have the power to change us forever, and sometimes the danger isn't in the unknown, but in those figures we believe to be safe and trustworthy. These stories you've just heard remind us of how the unknown and the seemingly ordinary can hide something deeply disturbing. Situations that, at first glance, seem ordinary, like an elderly neighbor, a stranger on the train, or a mentor, can, over time, reveal secrets that challenge our understanding. What scares us the most might not be the darkness itself, but the fact that it could be lurking in the people, places, and experiences of our daily lives. Reality, at times, is more terrifying than any fiction, because it is from reality that the stories that haunt us are born, even when the light of day tries to erase them. And now, I ask you, have you ever experienced something that made you question what you considered normal? Share, if you have the courage. After all, many of us have crossed paths with the unknown without even realizing it. Thank you for watching, and remember, true terror might be closer than you think.